Hi, TheHande here. So, earlier this year, I made a ranking of all the adventure games I ever played, and one of the adventure games which I mentioned was a horror point-and-click adventure game by the name of Clock Tower, made by Human Entertainment and originally released for the Super Famicom in Japan, and later ported over to the PlayStation 1 as Clock Tower First Fear, because the game's sequel, Clock Tower 2, was confusingly released as just Clock Tower in international markets. Now, Clock Tower is an important game in the sense that it is considered one of the first examples of a true survivor horror game, even though it did also feature quite a lot of typical point-and-click adventure game aspects. Now, real hardcore Clock Tower fans are probably aware that Clock Tower derives a lot of its inspiration from a 1985 Italian horror movie by the name Phenomena. And earlier this year, I actually finally got to watch Phenomena. The movie was made by notorious Italian director Dario Argento, who is a well-known name in Italian horror cinema. But the thing that has always kind of surprised me is that, considering how often it is mentioned that Clock Tower takes so much inspiration from Phenomena, I haven't really seen too many people talk about the actual similarities and the actual things that the game borrows from the movie. But also, after having watched it, I actually kind of noticed that there were pretty glaring differences to Clock Tower as well, so I decided I was going to make a little video talking about both of those things, all the things that Human Entertainment did lift for the game, and then all the things that are obviously quite different. But just to say very quickly about the movie in general, I really enjoyed it. In fact, I got on a bit of a Dario Argento kick this year and watched a whole bunch of his movies. But yeah, also, I guess, obviously a spoiler alert for both Clock Tower and Phenomena at the top of this video. Alright, before we get to the similarities, I think it would probably be worthy just giving a short synopsis of what actually happens in both the movie and the game, in order for the similarities to actually make any kind of sense. Phenomena takes place in Switzerland, follows a girl called Jennifer Corvino, played by Jennifer Connelly, who enters a all-girls school at a time when the surrounding area is being plagued by a serial killer who goes around killing young girls. Jennifer also suffers from bouts of sleepwalking and actually walks in on the killer, killing one of the girls. And on top of that, she has a special ability, which we will come back to in the differences section. But basically, she ends up on the trail of the murderer, which is kind of a typical theme in these Dario Argento films, held by a criminal entomologist, played by the excellent Donald Pleasence. And eventually, the killer is revealed to be the villainous Frau Bruckner, who works at the school, who's a psychopath, and who also has a horrifically deformed son who also seems to have some bloodthirsty tendencies as well. Clock Tower follows Jennifer Simpson, who, along with 3 other girls, is adopted by the mysterious Mr. Barrows, but when he goes to the Barrows mansion, all the other girls disappear. One of them already ends up dead at the very start of the game, where Jennifer is then chased around the house by this killer maniac called Bobby, who is the short guy with giant scissors, aka also known as the Scissor Man. And eventually it turns out that Mrs. Barrows is also on a bloodthirsty quest to kill all the girls. Now, from that, you may have already noticed that some of the more obvious similarities include 3 major characters: Jennifer, evil female villainess, and a deformed son of some kind. So it's no secret that Clock Tower's character Jennifer is obviously based on Jennifer from Phenomena, and more directly from Jennifer Connelly herself as the protagonist. But actually, beyond the physical appearance and name, the 2 Jennifers are actually vastly different characters in their respective medium, so we'll actually talk a little bit more about Jennifer when we come to the differences section. Now, the villainous planner, Frau Bruckner in the movie, and Mrs. Barrows in the film, are more or less similar, except Frau Bruckner in the film is actually a much more proactive killer, because actually the vast majority of the characters who are killed in the film are killed by her and not by her son. Nevertheless, there is a similar kind of twist in the film that Frau Bruckner is pretty much shown throughout the movie as being one of the few sympathetic adults at the school, until the very end when Jennifer is forced to stay the night at her house, which is when we start to realize that there's something seriously wrong with her. I mean, unless you already knew that Daria Nicolodi, who plays her, usually ends up playing a significant role in most of these Argento movies. But yeah, it is supposed to be a similar kind of shock twist moment as happens in Clock Tower, or at least if Jennifer discovers some of the secrets of the Barrows mansion before she meets up with Mrs. Barrows later in the game. Then there is the deformed son, although there aren't that many similarities there. Bobby is a much more prominent character in Clock Tower than Bruckner's son is in the actual film, because he doesn't even really physically appear until the very, very end, and his presence is only really hinted at the very beginning of the movie. Now, it is obvious that Bobby is a little bit based on Frau Bruckner's son, with his deformed face and him also attacking Jennifer at the end. I do have to assume that this visual might have inspired Bobby's appearance in Clock Tower. But what's also interesting, of course, is that the first victim in Phenomena is killed with a pair of scissors. That too is quite interesting, although I'm almost pretty much convinced that Frau Bruckner's son doesn't actually kill anybody in the film, then it is actually Bruckner all the way through. In fact, most of the similarities really are kind of visual things more than actual plot details from the movie. For instance, during one of Jennifer's sleepwalking incidents, she walks along the ledge of a building which gives way. This moment, I think, is very obviously lifted into the moments in Clock Tower where walkways just suddenly give away from underneath Jennifer's feet. There's a moment in the very end of Phenomena where Jennifer ends up in a lake with burning gasoline all around, and I think visually this is sort of lifted into that scene at the end of Clock Tower when Jennifer drops the gasoline on Dan, who is the other deformed son of Mrs. Barrows. And even before that, Jennifer in Phenomena is saved by a swarm of flies, whereas in Clock Tower, Jennifer is also saved by a slightly smaller swarm of crows in one of the game's many endings. There's also one little similarity, although I'm pretty sure this is completely incidental. In Phenomena, it's mentioned that Jennifer actually is a vegetarian, and Jennifer in the Clock Tower games is also mentioned to be vegetarian in the second game, but this is probably coincidental because it is explained in Clock Tower 2 that Jennifer becomes vegetarian because of the traumatic experience of seeing all her friends die in the first game. And also, this might be just a kind of coincidental as well, but Jennifer witnessing the death of one of the girls at the academy is sort of similar how Jennifer in Clock Tower sees one of her friends being murdered by Bobby at the very start. However, the deaths are visually kind of different, so I'm not sure if this necessarily counts. So from that, it actually becomes kind of evident that the inspiration that the Human Entertainment people took was mostly kind of visual cues and things in the visual language of the game rather than actual plot details, because there's quite a few different characters that don't appear in one or the other. Alright, then next we have to talk about the differences between Clock Tower and Phenomena, and there are actually surprisingly many. First and most important one actually has to do with Jennifer, who is a considerably different character between the game and the movie. Because of the limitations of Clock Tower's technology and the fact that the story kind of jumps in while the girls are in the mansion, Jennifer doesn't show that much personality in the first game other than being frightened, but it's established very early on at the beginning of Phenomena that Jennifer Corvino has a special ability, which is to telepathically communicate with insects, and this is actually a sizable part of the movie's story. This is the reason why Jennifer becomes involved with the search for the killer, because her sleepwalking incidents and her telepathy constantly lead her on the tracks of clues to the killer's identity, which she then presents to Professor McGregor, who's played by Donald Pleasance in the film. And also, whereas Jennifer being saved by crows in one of Clock Tower's endings is a kind of a payoff for her good deed of rescuing the crows, Jennifer in the Phenomena movie is shown just having the ability to summon insects to her. She summons a swarm of flies earlier in the film, and this is also paid off towards the end when those same flies come and attack Frau Bruckner's son on the boat. Another difference is that Mrs. Barrows in the story of Clock Tower has a kind of a tinge of supernatural element to her. I mean, I guess Jennifer's telepathy in Phenomena is kind of supernatural as well. But this also presents another important difference between the two Jennifers, and that is the fact that Jennifer Simpson in Clock Tower has a much closer tie to the central premise of the story. Because if the player digs around enough, they will find the secret room in the Barrows mansion, and inside, Jennifer finds the skeleton of her father, who was a doctor and helped deliver Mrs. Barrows' two sons. However, Jennifer also reads a letter from her father where he reveals that these two babies are possessed by demonic forces. One of them actually eats his arm. And after delivering the babies, Dr. Simpson is barricaded inside a room where he slowly suffocates to death, which is very different from Phenomena where Jennifer Cornevino just kind of stumbles upon the mystery of the girl killer. And also, like I said, while Mrs. Barrows is obviously somewhat inspired by Frau Bruckner, their motivations for their killings is honestly very different and kind of bizarre. Because especially for Bruckner, there doesn't really seem to be a clear motive. I mean, I guess that is kind of the point. Towards the end of the film, it's shown that she is quite insane. The first killing that happens at the very start of the movie seems to be motivated by nothing else but the fact that the girl just happens to barge into her house where her son has just run loose. The film does imply that Bruckner has this weird fascination with dead bodies, and that's why she also keeps body parts of the victims in that disgusting pool at the end of the movie. In Clock Tower, however, like I said, Mrs. Barrows clearly has some interest in the occult, and her son's demonic possessions are also signs of that. I think the game sort of implies that she continues to kill and sacrifice the girls she brings to the house to her second son, who is a gigantic monstrosity, a kind of giant killer baby, if you will. And then there are, of course, the more obvious differences. For instance, the setting of Clock Tower is contained entirely inside the Barrows mansion that Jennifer can't escape, while the setting of Phenomena at the girls' school has Jennifer wander around outside the buildings and confines, especially because she interacts so much with McGregor, the other secondary protagonist. And in fact, the fact that there are secondary protagonists in Phenomena is another big difference. Jennifer is really out on her own in Clock Tower, but there are several more characters working on the murder, including Inspector Geiger, the excellent McGregor as I mentioned, and also a chimpanzee. So yeah, that was this video. I hope you found that interesting. So tell me, have you watched Phenomena or played Clock Tower or possibly done both? And maybe share your opinions of the movie or the game in the comments down below. I'm Hanno the Hande Mäkinen. See you on the next one. Bye-bye.